as the topic was mentioned in the meetup and in all the emails that you got as part of the group, that today's topic is going to be an introductory session on AWS's Identity and Access Management, or it's called IAM. My name is Kamar Habib. I'm a senior solution architect based out of Dubai. I look mainly after enterprise customers, focusing mostly on customers that we call born in the cloud, that run all their operations in the cloud. So customers that like Kareem and others that are hosting the service on AWS. So I'm a solution architect helping them with their solutions as well. I've been with AWS for close to 3.5 years. I moved to Dubai around 10 months ago, and really enjoying it here. All right, so what we'll do is we'll cover the presentation in the first 35 to 40 minutes. I'll give a very quick demo on some fundamental concepts, especially for folks who haven't seen the console. They'll get an idea of what how identity IAM console will look, how we add users, and things like that. And then we'll leave at the end for questions and answers for you to chime in, or we can have discussion around different topics as well. Okay. So before I get started on a topic, how many of you know that we have a region coming up, an AWS region coming up in Dubai? I can't see. Let me see. Folks with their hands. Okay, so there's Khalid knows about it, and a few others. So quite a few folks don't know about it. So in AWS, we have a concept of what we call regions. Regions are generally based out of a city, and they're based on at least they compose of at least 3 availability zones. Availability zones meaning each availability zone could be one single data center or multiple data center together. So whenever we launch a region, we make sure that we at least launch with 3. In one instance we have 2 as well, but moving forward, all our regions we launch with 3 availability zones. So it provides full HA and redundancy. And we announced that we'll be having a region open up in Dubai, in UAE, not just Dubai, in UAE, in first half of 2022. So there's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of investment that we've made in supporting our customers here, especially for customers that have strong data residency requirements or latency requirements or things of that nature. This will be a great opportunity for you to really get introduced to our services and show your interest as well. Any questions on this region launch? I will open this up for a question now if there's any before we jump on the topic. Any question about the region, what it is? Everybody is comfortable with the idea of what an AWS region is? So right now, I think we have approximately 24 regions already. And we constantly keep announcing regions, and Dubai being one of them for next year.
If you say region, then it is compulsory to connect to some city, or region can be near to city, or it is near to country, or any...
Yeah, so it's usually based on a city. I mean, it's based within a country, usually based on, for example, in Australia, we have one region right now, which is the Sydney region. And we announced another region called Melbourne region, so for the city of Melbourne. However, in this case, in the case of UAE, it's kind of an exception to the rule. The region will have 3 data centers, but 2 of them will be located in Abu Dhabi, and 1 will be located in Dubai, because the cities are fairly close to each other. And so in this case, it's actually based out of 2 cities. The exact location of our data center, where they're hosted, this is not detail that we publish or even we are aware of. So this is something that in order to ensure highest level of security for customers, the location and where they are located is not announced, but the general idea that these will be based in these 2 cities, the region that's coming out. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks. All right, if there are no further questions, I'll get started. So why learn AWS Identity and Access Management? If you are coming from an on-prem background, I've been with I've been working with on-premises data centers and customer requirement especially from a networking perspective for a while. I was working at Cisco prior to joining AWS. So there's been a lot of, there are a lot of challenges in providing security before the advent of cloud, right? I mean, if you think of a corporate data center, being able to access every single resource software-wise, being able to access it, configure it, is not something that we are accustomed to in the data center. Yes, you can probably spin up VM, you can probably automate a few things, but generally being able to automate and treat the whole entire data center as a software, having visibility into what's happening across each of your resources, having that insight is generally not that easy. And if there are issues, they would have things like perimeter firewalls that are blocking malicious attacks. So we know about that. But however, in order to get an identity for which users or which resources are being attacked, it's very hard. It's a very big challenge that our customers have. So because security is generally implemented at the perimeter in a corporate data center, and inside the data center, then there's a lot of resources. In the world of the cloud in AWS, and the elasticity of the cloud is a direct consequence of the fact that everything is what you pay for, what you use to provision things with APIs. So you're provisioning everything with your APIs. I mean, that's why you can work so much faster in the cloud than you can do before. And when everything's controlled by APIs, it means that you have authentication and authorization at every level. And everything in AWS that you access is mediated by what we call that AWS Authentication and Authorization. That's AWS Identity and Access Management. So if you're going to build anything at AWS, then these are the security controls that you're going to need to use. And the nice thing about it is that that they're not only pervasive, but they're pretty uniform across the surface. So they're very uniform across the surface, and they provide authorization at every resource, right? So whether you're provisioning a VM or EC2 instance, whether you're provisioning a serverless function, which is Lambda, you're provisioning a database, or an object storage based S3, or you're provisioning a load balancer, every resource has pervasive security and identity defined in the cloud. So when we are talking about identity, we are talking about who has access to what. Okay, the who can be people like us, developers, or it could be administrators, or it could be finance people viewing certain resources. They don't have anything access to configure anything, but they have access to read things. It could be developers that have the developer environment and they can do anything they want, but when in production, only authorized people can run things, or even authorized pipelines can be used instead of people. So you will have automated process using continuous integration and continuous deployment, right? And the who can even be applications. So the applications that are running, whether they're running on a VM, whether they're running on a serverless function, or whether they're running on containers, these are applications, how and what they can do. And that's what the permissions will be. So who is the developers in the application, who can access, which is permissions, and then what? And then that's the concept of resources. I talked about resources in the previous slide. You had resources such as S3, you had resources such as KMS keys, which are our key management system. You have resources in a database. These are all resources. So who can access these resources, whether an application can access this resource or not. For example, if you look at a 3-tier application model, you perhaps would want the application tier to only be able to access the database, but not the web tier, right? So in that case, the web tier wouldn't have the right permissions, but the application tier would have the correct permission. So what is AWS IAM? AWS Identity and Access Management is a free authentication and authorization service for AWS. And why am I saying free? Because when you're initially opening up an account and you're spinning up resources, some of those resources will, especially if you have crossed the free tier, they will be costing you resources. However, when you're playing and you're trying to understand IAM, feel free to play around with the different identities, because as you're creating users, as you're creating groups, as you're creating policies, you're not incurring any cost. This is something that we provide as part of our core service for AWS. In other words, you use IAM to control who can use your AWS resources, which is authentication, and how they can use them, which is the authorization. So talking about authentication and authorization, just understand those concepts. Who can use your AWS resources is always going to be authentication, and how they can use them is authorization. These are two core concepts that we really need to understand, especially when we're using AWS services. Things like, when we go down the path of running containers, Kubernetes, for those who have used Kubernetes, authentication is done by AWS, but Kubernetes, if you're running it, authorization is done through the Kubernetes system. So, and that's something that EKS provides. When we cover a topic like Kubernetes and EKS, we can talk about that. So you can create and manage AWS users and groups directly within identity and access management. And you can enable even federated access via SAML from your corporate directory as well, using IAM. Okay. And then roles can be created and assumed to control what operations can be performed on by an entity or AWS service. Again, we'll look at a demo of that. So what are IAM users? IAM users could be you or me. An IAM user may be a human or an application that needs access to AWS services. IAM users must authenticate with an access key to interact with AWS via CLI or an SDK. Passwords are only needed to access the AWS console. So when you create an IAM user, and I'll show that in the demo, you're given an option to, as you're creating the user, to see if you want your access keys to be generated as well as console access, or you only want console access to be generated. So for accessing via CLI or SDK, you want to do API calls from your code, you will use the concept of what we call access keys and access credentials or roles to access those resources. However, if you want a user to be able to log in, that would need an AWS console access. And then, so that's IAM user, right? Groups in AWS IAM work pretty much like they do anywhere else. Instead of maintaining each user's permission individually, you assign permissions to the group and make the users members. Group members inherit the group's permission, okay? And this helps you in bulk permissions management, right? So instead of creating each user and assigning policy one by one, and especially if it's the same policy you're assigning, let's say you have 10 developers in your team and you want to assign them certain privileges to be able to do a particular access for them to be able to spin up some resources. Instead of going through each and every single user and attaching a policy to them, you create a group, you attach a policy one time to that group, and then you add all these users to that group, right? It's easy to change the permissions at a group level than as individual teams. Then coming on to IAM roles. So we talked about IAM users, right? Which is users like, it could be a user like you or me, or it could even be an application, which we'll discuss might not be the best way to assign an application a user level credential. We talked about groups. Then we have a concept of IAM roles, right? And IAM roles are similar to users in that they're identities with permissions determining what they can and they can't do, what a role can and cannot do. The major difference is that unlike users, IAM rules have no long-term credentials. That is passwords or access keys. So you don't have long-term credentials. To use a role, an entity must first authenticate as an IAM, identity and access management, or federated user with permission to assume that role. So obviously you can start seeing now that this is not a long-term credential. These are not long-term passwords. So which one do you think is more, what do you start sensing is going to be more better for you to use for applications? Is it going to be IAM users or IAM roles?
Roles.
Roles, perfect, yes. So roles is our recommended way of using, even as users, if you have a user or a group assigned, when you access an account, ideally you should be assuming a role and the administrator has defined that role, whether you're coming through an external identity provider or you're coming through IAM, you get that role and you're only able to access and do that instead of getting these long-term credentials to be able to do that. So if you can anybody tell me a use case for an IAM role? Have they used any?
Like in my organization, suppose the developer team is there, testing team is there, admin team is there, then I am going to create a different role, and depend on the users, I am going to attach that role.
Yeah, I mean that's an option. But however, what? Give me a good use case. Somebody was saying, give me a good use case of an IAM role being used. Let's say not for users, something a non-human being.
Yeah, like somebody wants to upload the file to S3 from on-prem, and then probably they will access via role. So that role will have our put permissions, and also have a they have a proper principle, like it should have the permissions to upload the file, like SML permissions, right? So to upload the file to
yeah, so that you're talking about an external identity provider, the SAML based role, assuming an identity and assuming a role based on the identity that they authenticated against, and being able to perform actions. Very good. There's another very common use case, and that's the demo I'll show today, is like, for example, an EC2 instance. For those that don't know what EC2 is, EC2 is our virtual machine, a VM that we spin up in the AWS cloud. So EC2 instance, when you create it, by default, it does not have permission to do anything, right? But if you want that instance to be able to do things, for example, you want that EC2 instance to be able to talk to an RDS database, or you want that EC2 instance to be able to list files from your S3 bucket, your S3 your object storage bucket, then that instance will apply, then you can apply a role to that instance, an EC2 role to that instance. And that's a very common use case, and I'll demo that to you at the end. Great feedback, by the way. So this pictures contains everything you need to know about IAM, right? It's from our introduction page that we talk about. So it must be the most simple breakdowns of terms, correct? Well, not really. So what I'm going to do is take this. This is from our user guide. I know this is very complicated. I mean, not complicated, but an eye chart. And it's not really that clear exactly what we're trying to show here. What I'm going to do is we'll look at IAM from a 10,000 feet view and then break it apart, right? So we're going to look at these components. What is that principle? What is authorization? What is action? What are resources? In this session, we'll go through each of these and break this out and explain what's going on in this picture. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll have a good idea, all right? So the way IAM works, right, is when a principal tries to use the AWS Management Console or the AWS API or the AWS CLI, that principal sends a request to AWS. The request includes the following information, which creates a request context. So so when a request is sent by whether it's a management console, by an API or a CLI call that you're doing from your CLI, you are requesting something from AWS, and that request contains the following. So first of it is actions or operations. The actions or operations that the principal wants to perform. So what does the principal want to do? Principal being, it could be a principal, could be yourself, it could be an application, it could be let's say an EC2 instance. Principal could be the resource, the person that's trying to do the operation, right? So for example, you're trying to perform an action, the action or operation that principal wants to perform. This action, this can be an action in the AWS Management Console or CLI or API. Then there's resources. So we talked about the principal wanting to do an action, and then there's resources, the AWS resource object upon which the actions or operations are performed. So a resource could be something like an EC2 service or S3 service. These are all resources that you can take action on. Then you have the principal. We talked about the principal. The principal is the person or application that use as an entity, is a user or role to send the request. Information about the principal includes the policies that are associated with the entity that the principal uses to sign in. Then we have environment data. Environment data could be things like IP address or user agent, or whether SSL is enabled or what time of the day it is. So those can be captured as well. And then we have the resource data related to the resource that is being requested. This can include information such as what is the name of the DynamoDB table or the S3 bucket, or what is the tag on the Amazon EC2 instance. So these are all the things that are coming in as part of the request, right? Again, we talked about that. Before we go deeper, breaking down to IAM, we want to talk about, pause for a second and explain. I think I explained this before as well, but I want to bring that up again, difference between authentication and authorization. Okay, for the purpose of this talk, they're defined as authentication is a principle that must be authenticated or signed into AWS using their using their credentials to send a request to AWS. Okay, so some services such as S3 and STS allow few requests from anonymous users, but generally users need to be authenticated to do actions, right? During authorization, AWS uses values from the request. We talked about the request context to the check for policies that apply to the request. It then uses those policies to determine whether to allow or deny that request. So even if you're authenticated, doesn't mean you can do the action. That's based on the authorization. Okay, so let's break down IAM into its core components. If you understand these three things, which I'm going to show you, understanding an IAM policy will become much more simple. When an IAM request starts, you must have a principal. A principal is a user, a role, a federated user, or application that send the request, and the policies associated with that principal. The principal then must take an action. An action is what is the principal attempting to do? And this action must affect a resource. A way to help you understand these core elements is to liken it to an English sentence. So compare the subject, verb, object structure of the sentence. I am learning IAM. This is what are you doing? So I am, you're the subject, which is the principal. You're learning, you're performing an action, you're the verb, and you're performing it on object. I know this sounds very simple right now, but when you start looking at the policy, which is in a JSON format or JSON, however you want to call it, JSON, you realize that, okay, what am I supposed to write here? But if you have these things aligned, that there has to be a principle, there has to be an action. What action is it doing, and what is the resource the action is being performed on? You'll be able to understand the policies much better. The subject, what is trying to take an action, the verb is action being taken, and the object identifies what is being acted upon. Or you can even say Merlin stops at EC2 instance. So Merlin is the subject, stops is the verb, and EC2 instance is the resource. Right. So now we talked about IAM user, we talked about IAM group, we talked about IAM role. Okay. Now, what about IAM policies? What are those? So when you create a role or a user or a group, by default, they don't have any access to do anything, right? So for those users and roles and groups to be able to do things, you have to define a policy and attach the policies to them. Okay, so we have two policies, managed policies. Our standalone policy that you can manage separately from the IAM users, groups, or roles to which they're attached. And then you can have customer managed policies. That's the one that you create and manage in your AWS account. Using customer managed policies, you have more precise control over your policies than when using AWS managed policy. I mean, ideally you want to use the managed policy that AWS has already provided for you. But again, your business might have a particular criteria or a particular requirement to do things in a certain way. And in that case, they'll want a managed or customer managed policy. You want to define a particular policy and attach it to your user role. Unless there are questions, I guess if there are questions in the chat, we'll take them later, right? Because I can't really see the chat right now, so I will. Okay.
No questions now.
Okay, so if there are any questions, we will take them at the end as well. So keep your questions. Then we also have, so we talked about policies, the managed policies and customer managed policies and custom managed policies the customer creates, right? Then there's also what we call inline policies. Inline policies, so suppose you're testing something and temporarily you want to give yourself access to a particular thing and you want to take it away for a single user or something, you want to attach a single policy and you want a more granular thing granular permission, you can attach inline policies, right? Not really the most recommended way of doing things, but yes, sometimes inline policies are needed. The better way is to do custom manage or customer managed policies or AWS managed policies, but you will have some use cases of using inline policy as well. It forces a strict one-to-one relation between the policy and the principles. Avoid attaching the wrong policy to the principle, and ensure the policy is deleted when deleting a principle. So it's good to know when inline policies need to be done. When do you choose inline versus managed policies? We recommend managed policies for most use cases for all the reasons that you see here. Any questions on this, like reusability, central change management, all these things you won't be able to do with inline policies. You cannot reuse them, you cannot centrally manage them. Versioning and rollback is available in managed policies. Delegation of permissions management is available on managed policies. Automatic updates for AWS managed policies are available. And then larger policy size are available as well for managed policies. Now, we talked about policy. What does a policy look like? Now that we have a basic flow of how a policy flows in a concept, let's break apart what a policy document looks like. First, policy statements are JSON formatted, okay? Second, they contain a principle, right? We talked about it. They contain a principle. They contain an action. They contain a resource, and are often modified by a condition called by a condition. So the acronym that we use is PARC. PARC is the condition that we have, right? A principal is a person or application that can make the request for an action or operation on an AWS resource. As I mentioned, the principal is authenticated as the AWS account user or IAM entity to make requests to AWS. As a best practice, do not use your root user credentials for your daily work. Instead, create IAM entities, users, and roles. You can also support federated users or programmatic access to allow an application to access your AWS account. Okay, so that's an important point. When you create your account the first time, whatever email, whatever ID you use, that is your root account. That root account has ability to add your credit card details, close your account, spin up whatever they want. It has full rights to run on your AWS account. So if you have created your personal account, or even if you are if you're a small company and you've opened up an account, we've seen customers use their root account to do everything and give that root account access to multiple users. They're sharing passwords and stuff. We highly discourage using that. Root account should be created and used once, the root user, and then locked up. You should never use that root user. After you create your root user, you create an IAM user, even with admin privileges, and then assign roles and privileges based on that. So highly recommended that once you create your account, your root account, you lock it up, you don't use that, and you secure it. So you ensure that nobody steals that root account, right? Then we have the actions. Actions are operations that principal wants to perform. This can be an action, as I mentioned, to management console, operation, or CLI. Then you have the AWS resource, and resource is usually given with an ARN. You'll see any AWS resource will have a concept of called ARN, which is Amazon resource name. That's what it stands for, ARN, right? And then the condition is the operator that you can use in policy, right? So if you're looking at our verb, the sentence that we had before, you have IAM, the subject, the learning is IAM, and then you have the condition here in Dubai. You're putting yourself, you're not learning everywhere else, you're learning right now in Dubai. So that you've restricted your of how you're accessing this policy, and that's what condition are going to do. So you can put a condition to say only this IP address can do these actions, or only this only if it's coming in this time range you can do this action. All those things can be configured as part of the condition. So there are multiple options in configuring the conditions. Okay, so general IAM tips: be as specific as possible when creating the policies. Okay, roles are better than users. Users are better than accounts. Account level, giving account level access, and accounts are better than services. So you're giving access to the full entire service. right? So the best option is to give roles. IP whitelist should not be relied on as a mechanism for authorization. Just because an action coming from an IP address does not mean that the IP address is authorized to take that action. So something to keep in mind. So these are just the general IAM tips, right? Okay, principal examples. Let's look at some of the examples of a principal. An entity that is allowed or denied access to a resource. That's a principal indicated by an Amazon resource name. With IAM policy, the principal element is implicit. The user, group, or role is attached. So looking at this, so everyone is anonymous users, principal is star.star. That's everyone, basically. You want to replace that with your account number. This is better. You're replacing with an account, but you're not giving access to everybody, right? And then giving it access to an individual user. So you're taking an ARN, you give this your account, and then you're specifying it to a username. And then also there's another option to give it to a federated users using Web Identity Federation. So let's say you log in through your google.com account and you get federated access to the AWS account. That's the principal that will have access to the policy. Or you can say a specific role, right? A specific role has access to that policy. That's the principal. This is how you're identifying the principal or accessing a resource, right? And then a specific service is service, such as ec2.amazonaws.com. That's a service in itself. What makes a good principal? In IAM role, we talked about being specific. In a role trust policy, you must specify an account ID. It's better to specify the role rather than an entire account. So not a great idea to give everything in the root account access as a principal. It's better to give a role name rather than give access to the root user. You have a role name. That's the better option in making a good principal. What are good examples of action? So action, again, describes the type of access that should be allowed or denied. You can find actions in the document or use the policy editor to get a drop down of all the actions that are available. Statements must include either action or not action element. So these are the ways to do it. So if you click through the examples, you'll see that this is an action is EC2 start instances, right? Another action is IAM change password. Another action is S3 get object. So these are all actions. You can specify multiple values for action. So you can say, I want to give this particular principal that has authenticated action to send SQS send message and SQS receive message. Or you can even give wildcards based on the IAM access key that has been used to authenticate into the account. Understanding the not action. Okay, so there we talked about action. There's also a not action. I do want to stop and mention about not action. They can help you write shorter policies. For example, in these two examples, which allows you access to everything except IAM APIs. Are they both the same? If you've seen this, if you've seen something like this before, not action, you can probably speak up. Which allows access to everything except IAM APIs. Okay, let me just add that. So the left box is not a deny. A second policy in this case may grant the user access to the IAM, whereas the right box denies IAM and that user will never be able to access the IAM APIs, right? So this is because the order of the IAM operations is important, and that's what it allows you to do. However, this action is in a much shorter format. You're able to define this action of granting access to the user. So this is not a deny. So user could still have separate policy that grants IAM action. However, if you want to prevent the user from ever being able to call IAM APIs, you can use an explicit deny. Okay. What makes a good action? Oftentimes, when attempting to develop policies and chaining together service policies with wildcards and actions to save time, this ends up not saving time in the long run because it leads to insecure deployments and makes security work harder. Okay, so if you look at this example, right, this is a terrible action. You're allowing IAM to be able to do everything for this IAM user. This is bad. You're saying, okay, you can create, delete, list, and update. You can do 4 actions, but it's still giving quite a bit of power for the principal to perform these actions. A better one would be that only a principal which is authenticated with a particular access key is able to perform these actions. A better way is to wildcard the verb part of the action name. So access key with stars on both sides allows only access key actions. Okay, so these are the only actions that will be allowed. Now, resource examples, right? The objects are objects being requested. Sorry, somebody is unmuted. Does somebody have a question? There is somebody unmuted. Yeah. Okay, cool. Then resource example, the object being requested. Statements must include either resource or not resource element. So in our case, we have the S3 bucket is the resource. Then all S3 buckets except one. So you can say I want this, all the resources to be accessed except for this particular resource, right? Or you can say replace it with your account number. So you can specify the resource that you're accessing. You can even do multiple resources as well. So in this case, we have DynamoDB table. You're giving 2 tables as your resource. And then you can say all EC2 instance for an account in a particular region, right? So you're saying in US East 1, all the instances will have access, all the EC2 instances in US East 1. That's the resource that's being identified. Condition examples, what if you wanted to restrict access to a time frame or an IP address chain, right? So you start with a condition statement, you provide a date greater than statement, you provide a date less than statement, right? And you can provide a list of IP addresses, and then you close the condition, okay? So you want to access, you wanted to make this condition. Remember we talked about condition is going to restrict the policy to be able to only be applied if these conditions are met true. So in this case, we are saying this has to be the time frame, date greater than, date less than, and then the IP address from these 2 particular source IPs, right? And this is an AND action. All these conditions are AND, but then anything in the bracket amongst the line is an OR action. So either this IP can come in or this IP can come in these 2 particular times, and that would be an allowed. So allow user access to a resource under the following condition. The time is after 11 a.m. on 1/1/2020, and the time is 4:03 p.m. on 12/31/2020, and the request can come from IP addresses 192.0.2.0 or 203.0.113.0/24 range. Okay. All of these conditions must be met for the statement to evaluate to true. Then we finally want to touch upon the variables within the IAM policies. You can use a number of attributes and variables including tags. This allows you to simplify your policies and reduce hard-coded attributes inside your policies. So you can use principal-specific policies, provider-specific. You can use tags. You can use SAML keys. Again, we offer predefined variables based on the service request that you're coming from. So it provides the benefits of simplifying your policy management. It reduces the need for hard-coded user-specific policies. So for example, you can say, as a user logs in, based on their username, that is the S3 bucket. So you variabilize the name of the S3 of the username, and you give them access to that particular S3 bucket based on that user ID. Okay, so you can do that with other resources as well. So it helps you automate that process and not have hard-coded usernames and user policies within your policy. Okay. So again, looking at the anatomy with the policy variables that I talked about, right? To break apart this policy, first always make sure that you put the right version statement, okay, into your policy. The version is required, and it's not today's date. Okay, this is always going to be the same version number. Okay, this is a common. This is the one. It tells the IAM engine what version of policy is using. So it's not something that you put today's date. You always put this date. Okay. From here we have we have a variable in the condition referring to AWS username, right? Here we allow based on the variable in the resource ARN. Okay, so you can see that we have been able to variabilize that. So instead of hard coding the username, we are able to extract those from the policy variables that I talked about earlier. We're able to extract those, the AWS username, and give access based on whether you're giving it based on prefix or the resources. We allow based on variable in the resource ARN. So the policy grants user access to a home directory in S3 that can be accessed programmatically. That's what it's doing. Okay, so it's giving access to a home directory, home/Kamran, right? For example, in the S3 bucket, right? That has my name /Kamran as well. All right, so that's what it's providing. All right, so I already mentioned that. So what makes a good resource? Making a good resource policy easy. Just go as far to the right as possible. It's better to have 2 resources in a policy than starting an entire service policy. Okay, so this is terrible. Starting entire S3 is not the best idea, right? A better would be to give the actual resource. Okay, to give the actual resource. Now this is a bit of an eye chart in terms of the flow, but it's important to understand how we evaluate the policy. By default, user does not have any permission. So by default, everything is denied. If there's no policy attached, it's always going to be a deny. Then after that, if there's a policy attached, and for example, you're allowing or giving a permission, then it goes to the next action. Okay. Now we have multiple ways of assigning policies and implementing policies as well. So we have a concept of called organization SCPs. I won't go into that, but if you have, let's say, a company and you have multiple AWS accounts, you can define a top-level organization policy on which services that can be used within the account, or you want to restrict certain services across your entire organization. You would use what we call the organization SCPs. Then we have the concept of resource-based policies. Resource-based policies are things like on the S3 bucket, which is the resource, the policies that are assigned to it. Then we have the IAM permission boundaries. We didn't discuss that, but you can assign boundaries to a permission. So even if you, let's say the policy gives you full access, at an account level, if you define permission boundaries for those users or groups, then they won't be able to perform those actions if you've restricted the permission boundary. So basically it's like, restricting boundary regardless of what the policy the user will have. Then you have the session policies. These are temporary policies. These are temporary credentials that the session will have. Let's say like the EC2 role will have access to a particular service, particular resource, and they're given a session, they're able to perform certain actions. And then finally, you have the identity-based policies, which attach to users, groups, or roles. It grants permissions to associate identity, and is typically required to enable access. Okay, so a bit of an eye chart, but it kind of gives you the policy flow for IAM. You can see that there's a lot of topics to discuss when we come to IAM, but I hope the initial primer on what IAM, how policies are done, what are the main conditions, was a bit clear from the session. So what are some of the IAM best practices? AWS has seen many customers pursue deployments, only to reverse course if they have done like waterfall-based deployment. Success demands an iterative approach. Okay, this is the way to ensure that security capabilities keep with the customer demands, and the key to transforming security into business enablers, right? So you have to take an iterative approach. You can't just define something at the start when you've set up your initial account and you set up your company and you define these policies and you forget and you're just letting it grow and you don't have an idea what's going on. You constantly need to reevaluate and iterate on how you're defining policies, how you're giving access, how you're ensuring that the minimum level of access is given to the user, rather than giving a permissive access. Okay, and that's where we have the concept of DevSecOps or DevOps with security. The combination of the philosophies, the cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that exploit the advances made in IT automation to achieve a state of production immutability, right? And that's where you want to automate things, right? Automate things and automate things at scale as well. And having things like pipelines, DevOps pipelines to be doing things and moving your security to the left. Also, locking away your AWS account. I talked about that. Create individual IAM users. We talked about that user, and instead of creating individual IAM users, assign them to a group, grant them least privileges, use managed policies versus inline policies. Right, or if you can't use an AWS managed policies, use customer managed policies. Configure a strong password policy for your users. This is a key thing. Enable MFA for privileged users. MFA being multi-factor authentication for your account, especially for your root account. You want to have MFA for your root account in case for some reason your password gets compromised. There's MFA to block that access. So we talked about granting least privilege to policies, configuring strong parts. So these are some of the best practices. Some of the other best practices: using roles for applications that run on Amazon EC2 instances, right? Rather than assigning access keys. So sometimes we've seen our customers create a user, take their access key and put it in the code, right? Not a good idea, right? Because you have that code and you might push that to a public Git repo, and those IAM credentials are exposed to everybody. And that's a big security threat, right? So someone can steal those credentials and spin up instances and do things in your account. That's why the best thing is to use roles for applications that run on Amazon EC2 instances. Delegate it by using roles instead of sharing credentials and passwords. Rotate your credentials regularly. Remove unnecessary credentials that have been created in your account. Use policy conditions that I talked about for extra security. And then monitor your activity in your AWS account. So one of the things that I talked about at the start is everything you can do in AWS. You treating your whole entire infrastructure like a software cloud. Everything is accessible by API, and not only that, every API call you make to provision resources or to perform an action is monitored and tracked in your account activity by something called CloudTrail. So you can monitor your API activities that are being logged against your AWS account using CloudTrail. So it gives you that access, this insight into what's happening to your account, and then you can also automate actions based on those. Okay. With that, I'll give a short demo, just introducing the concept of policies and policies. Can you all see my console right now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I have this. I've got multiple. I've got like 2 instances, but this is the instance that I've created just today. Like you can see, I created this right about 6:40 p.m. So pretty recently created instance. So this is for our demo. This is an EC2 instance, right? For those that are looking at the console for the first time, when you want to spin up a VM in AWS, you just go launch instances. You select your AMI, what kind of instance type you want to choose. So for example, in this case, we do have options for Mac OS, we have options for Red Hat, Windows, Ubuntu. We have a lot of options, or you can bring your own particular AMIs as well and bring that and use it, right? So I have some AMI that I created, right? So you can use that. So what I did was I just chose the standard Amazon Linux instance. So we also have the different instance sizes, instance types. I chose the default T2 micro instance type. Then you have all the other options. I'm not going to go through that. You can add storage. You can add tags to your instances. You can define security groups on who can access what ports can access this instance. And then you launch an instance. So I've already launched an instance now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to log into this instance. You can see that how you want to log into this instance. I used an SSH key to create it. So I'm going to log into this particular instance. Let me share my screen for that. I have it on the other. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger in case you can see. Can you see my screen? Is this the
Yes,
font available? Okay, the font's good. So I've logged in. So I created this. Let me move this thing. Let's zoom in on here. All right. I've logged into my EC2 instance based on the exact commands. I've used my key. I've logged into the user. Now, when I'm going to this account, I don't have. This is my CS. Remember, I talked about in AWS you can access using your SDK. You can access using AWS SDK. You can access AWS from the console, like I did. You know, I'm using API call, but I'm using a console to access all these things. Or I can use a command line. Right, so we offer a command line which starts with AWS, and we can list resources based on that. So I'm going to try to see if I have anything that I can list on my S3 bucket. You can see that I don't have any credentials configured, so I'm not able to list these resources. Now, again, in this case, what is the principle when I'm trying to access this bucket? Who can tell me what the principle is in this case? From all the things we discussed, the principle that's trying to access the S3 bucket.
EC2.
Very good, EC2 instance. So the EC2 instance is the principle, right? This is because I'm using my, it's not me, it's the EC2 instance. I've logged into it. And I'm trying to access the S3 bucket. What is the action?
List.
Yeah, list. So I'm doing a list on
S3.
what resource? Oh, very good. So there is no condition. Remember the PARC we talked about? So the principle is the EC2 instance. The action I'm doing is I'm doing a list, and the resource is an S3 bucket. There's no condition. I haven't put any condition on this. So that's what I'm trying to do. Now, how can I make this EC2 instance be able to access the resource? Remember when we talked about it, the first one was I can just create a user, right? So what I've done here, I've created this user called IAM user. Now this IAM user, let me just go through the process of creating a user, especially for people who haven't seen it. So the user, you can create a user. This is like, you know, the user, any user that can be created. So let's say Dubai UG user, right? I talked about, remember when you create the user, you can give them access to either both having console password access, so they can actually log into the AWS console, or just programmatic access. Right. So in this case, we're just giving programmatic access. I'm not going to assign any permissions to it. So these are the existing policies that are already there. Remember, we talked about AWS managed policies. These are the policies that are there, but I'm not going to assign any policies to this user. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and create this. So it's already warning me that this user has no permissions. This user has no permissions. You're creating this user, but it's not going to be able to do anything. So because I haven't assigned any policies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a user. I'll go copy this. I'm going to copy these to my notepad here. So this is what I'm going to use. Yeah, this is going to be recording. I'm going to delete this user. So I'm hoping there's no security threat after this. So yeah, I've created these users. So once this has been done, I'm going to go ahead and configure this user on my EC2 instance. Okay. So how do I configure this? I go AWS configure. I'll provide my access key ID that I got. I'll provide the secret access key ID that I got. Also, I'm going to define a region name. The region I'm using is Ireland right now. That's my default region where I've spun up. Now, what do you think will happen? Who can say when I do an AWS S3 LS, what do you think will happen? Last time I got, sorry?
I think permissions are not there into that.
Permissions are not there, right? So last time it gave me an unable to locate credentials. Now I've added the credentials, right? Now giving me it's still not giving me the bucket, but it's still giving me a different error. It's saying that I cannot list the bucket because I remember I didn't assign any buckets to this user. Now the next thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign this this user. I'm going to assign a role. I'm going to create a role. Okay, so this is the role. Remember we talked about user, and I'm going to create a role. I'm going to create a role called a role is, again, you can use the service you're using. So I'm going to use the service is going to be, in this case, the principal or the service I'm going to use is EC2. You can see there's all these other principles I can use. I can use S3 as a principal, like the Authentication as a principal. But the most common use cases are using EC2, which is what I'm using. So I'm going to use EC2 as my basically my principal, right? My service. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign S3 privileges to this. So I'll give S3 full access. Okay, I want to give it a tag, and I'll call this name Dubai UG S3. So I've just given this name of Dubai user group S3, and I've created this role. Okay, now when I go to this role, how do I assign this role to the EC2 instance? This is when I go back again to my EC2 instance, right? I go to IAM demo and actions, and then there's a security option here. Over here, you can see that there's an option to say modify IAM role, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a role here. It should be showing up, the Dubai user group S3 right there. So I've assigned this role. Now, when I assign this role, what do you expect to happen? What do you expect to happen here after I assign the role to this EC2 instance when I'm making the call?
I think user should also have that permission, right?
Yeah, very good. You're very smart. So yes, I still will not be able to do it because the user is going to take priority over the role that I've assigned. Right? Again, remember we talked about the least privilege. The deny will always take precedence over an allow. So right now, the user policy does not allow me to access the S3 bucket. But even though the role is assigned, so what I'm going to do is now I'm going to delete these credentials that I created, right? So my credentials are stored here. This is the credentials that are stored here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all these credentials. Now I don't have any user configured. Now, if I do an AWS S3 LS, there you can see all my buckets. These are all my buckets that have shown up. Okay, so these are all in my account. Right? If I go to S3 here, the S3 is our object storage. If I go to S3 here, you can see that all the buckets that I have listed in my account here are now available to this EC2 instance. So this EC2 instance is now the principal. It's doing an action of S3 LS on the resource, which is S3, and it's able to get this bucket. Okay, so if I try to do create a DynamoDB table, it will not work because the only permission I've given on that role that I've assigned to the EC2 instance is to be able to query S3 and no other role. Okay, so with that, that was just a brief intro to IAM, a quick view at the IAM users and roles. So you can see that you have in terms of IAM, we have the users, the roles. We talked about the user groups. We talked about the policies. One thing again. So let me ask a quick question. So I created this policy right now, right? So where's the Dubai? No, not the policy. I created the role. Like a Dubai user group S3, and in this, the permissions there. This is Amazon S3 full access. Now over here, this is the policy. Remember we showed the documents. In this case, we're saying allow action on anything S3 and any resource within the S3 account, right? So S3 resource, that's the action for any of the buckets that I have in the account. So this has pretty much full power on all my S3 buckets. However, remember we had the concept of principal, action, resource, and condition. What's missing here in this policy?
Condition.
A condition is missing, but is condition wasn't
Principal.
mandatory. Principal missing. Why is the principal missing here? Who can tell me?
It's a policy. Okay.
I think it's because it's
Anybody
an
else?
open policy that can be attached to any principal.
No, a better no. What is the principle in this case?
The rule here is the principal.
Yeah, the role, because this policy can only be assigned to either a role or user, right? So it's assumed that we take care of that. We are taking care of the principal in this case. So you don't have to define it, because as you're attaching this policy to a role or user, we already know when you attach it to a role or user that the principal is a role, or a principal is a user. You don't need to define principal. However, if you have resource-based policies, so such as S3, right? S3 has resource-based policies. In that, you will have to assign the principal as well. I want to see if I have a bucket that has a policy. Let me see. Yeah, I don't think I have, but anyway, when you assign a bucket policy here, this is where you'll have to define a resource, because the bucket doesn't know what the resource is going to be. So over here, you'll have to say, okay, this is the Kamran is the user that's trying to access. He's the only one who's going to have access to this bucket. Okay, so a bit different in terms of how we look at resource. If it's already assigned to a role or user as part of the policy, AWS has already taken care of what the principle is in that case. Okay. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. I'll leave the floor open for any questions you have or any thoughts. I know we covered quite a bit, but I just wanted to give an overview of IAM. How do I share this? Stop this. Yeah, stop share. Okay. Anas, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Kamran. So guys, if you have any questions, now's the time. Just jump in.
Yeah, just one question. I just wanted to ask, like, do we have real use case of where the people are using inline policy? Because I've never used this inline policy like as of now. Like,
Yeah,
do we really use it inline policy?
Not if you don't need it, that's the best thing. Unless you need it. So for example, let's say you're testing a particular service, and you have permissions to access 10 S3 buckets, let's say, right? The policy allowing you to access 10 S3 buckets. Now you're testing and you need to access this one more bucket. Instead of rewriting the whole policy, you just add an inline policy, and this is temporarily. You're temporarily testing that one S3 bucket that you're uploading things to, right? So you add this one policy temporarily, and you add it, and then once you're done with it, you can remove it. So that's a lot of people use it for test use cases.
Okay, so as such, real use cases, not just for testing purposes.
Yeah,
like
that's one use case. I'm sure customers have. I can look things up into what customers have used, but customers do use inline policies sometimes. But if you can avoid it, try your best. As I mentioned, managed policies provide a lot of other benefits that inline policies would not.
Yeah, because as you said, right? So inline policy, like if you delete it, all the other things like granular permissions you give to that specific user, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yeah, so I mean, I did cover quite a bit of content. We covered the policy document, the JSON format. But if you get the main construct of how policies are defined, the principle, the action, the resource, and the condition, that was the key. I hope that was a bit clear for everybody. And if you want to dive deeper into IAM policies, we can do that in further sessions in the future.
Any more questions, guys? We will be publishing this. We will be publishing this talk, this presentation on our YouTube channel, on the MENA YouTube channel, and share it on meetup.com. So for your references. Hi, Cameron.
Hey, welcome.
I just got one question, like when you're taking this presentation, you in the SLI command, you mentioned that S3 is an action and S3 is an resource also, or object also.
I said ls. Remember, I had the command AWS S3 and ls. Ls was the action list. I think Shafi mentioned that. The list is the ls command. So even in Linux, you use the ls command, right? So our CLI has the format of AWS, the resource, which is S3, and you can do an ls of the buckets, the list of all the buckets. So the ls was the action, and then the S3 was the resource.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
And other thing, like when you say like I got this concept, but many times I read question, I do not get like I am a users is connected to the role, and user is connected to the policies also, and roles can
No. User is not connecting the role. Role is going to be either you can assign it to a resource like EC2. Remember, we did that in our demo. We assigned the role to EC2 instance, or you can assign it to a federated user, a user that's coming from outside. It's authenticated. Let's say from you have your on-prem directories, your LDAP or your Microsoft Active Directories, or you have a third-party identity provider, or you have things like Google Identity Provider or Facebook. You log in through that. Once you log in, you authenticate into AWS. That's when you can assume a role and be able to perform the action. Okay, but the user is user. The user is not taking over the role.
Just for a bit more clarity, I got answer 90%. Like when users, like my name is Indrajit, in the company they have created users for me, but you for my users they can attach some other role also, no, like development role, or testing role, or
you can create roles. When you say they create a user for you, that's in AWS they create a user, or they create a user in a third-party provider.
I cannot answer. I'm new to it. I'm just
okay.
Maybe my question is not right because as I mentioned, I'm new to this AWS.
No, it's fine. There's no wrong question. That's totally a fine question, right? So if you're created in AWS as a user, okay, then that's the access. You'll have to authenticate through IAM as a user to be able to perform those actions, and whatever policy is attached to your user, or if you're part of a group, that's what you can do. Now, what happens is there is a limit in IAM. You can, if you have a really large organization, let's say for, I think there's Majid Al Futtaim here, if they have like 20,000 employees, let's say, for example, right? IAM has a limit for 5,000 users. Of what happens after 5,000 users, we don't recommend creating all these IAM users and groups in AWS for that matter. In that case, we recommend using a third-party provider, right? So you have an external identity provider, you're authenticating to that. Let's say you have your on-prem Microsoft AD, or you're using Azure AD or something like that. You're authenticating through that. And then once you come in to AWS, you're authenticating through those paths, you're coming into AWS, and you're going to assume a role. In that case, you're assuming a role. You're not using user. You're assuming a role, and that role will give you the permissions that you have to perform those actions.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Guys, any more questions? I guess this is it. Thank you all. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you all for joining, for your time.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anas, for organizing.